What do you get when you combine the Boba Tea Bear from the Café series, Honey from the Charcuterie Board of Christmas Series 2, and the Whizbees from the Harry Potter Honeydukes collection? Well, you get a darling one-of-a-kind Miniverse remix. And on today's video, I am going to show you exactly how you can make one of these for yourself. The first step is making bees. This is the mold that is used for Whizbees in the Harry Potter Honeydukes collection. In this video, I'm using clear UV resin and adding color. This is the UV resin we'll be using. This is not sponsored, but it's a great resin and I recommend it. Let's start with alcohol ink for our colorant. I know this is safe to use with UV resin because it will not affect its ability to cure. Other things like acrylic paint can interfere with the curing process. I've got a little silicone mat, a silicone cup, and these bees are tiny. It takes very little resin to fill up these little molds. I think I probably used about 6 drops, maybe 7 drops of the alcohol ink. And I'm filling up the molds using the little spoon that came in most of the Honeydukes collection. Now, when I hit this with the UV light to cure it, I started to see a lot of air bubbles. And so I did my best to try and maybe pop the bubbles or push the part of the resin that had bubbles in it out. I can't tell you that I did a terribly good job. I turn over the mold so that the UV light can cure both sides and make sure it's nice and solid. And then here is the finished bee. Look at how tiny these bees are, but they still have great detail. I just love these bees. I had some resin left over, and I've been working to try and fill up the box for the every flavor jelly beans. It takes a lot of jelly beans to fill up the little box in the Honeydukes collection. So I'm going to use the excess resin that I made for the bees and make some beans at the same time. So I need to clean my little silicone cup, and I do that simply by curing the resin that's left inside, and then it just pops right out and it's nice and clean and ready for the next set. I'm going to try using pastels. Now these are dry chalk pastels, and this is another thing that I got on Amazon, very inexpensive, and I love all of these colors. You can imagine what kind of wonderful things you can make with resin if you use all these colors. And I'm also using some pieces from the Armadillo Vial of the Harry Potter Potions Miniverse collection. To crush up the pastel chalk, I'm going to use the mortar and pestle. And you just add that right straight to the resin. And then I'm trying to be very careful as I mix this not to introduce a lot of air and get a lot of extra bubbles. But you do need to mix this very thoroughly. Now this go around, I chose a different method to fill the molds. What I am doing here is I'm actually kind of painting the detail part of the mold with a very, very thin coat of resin. That way I know for sure that I've got resin in the eyes and in all the little lines. And then of course turn it over to cure. And then the second time I go back in and I fill the mold the rest of the way, and then I cure it again. I did find that worked really, really well. Look how cute that bee is. Now, it does come out with some debris around the edges quite often. This happens to me a lot with these little tiny molds. And so what I chose to do is to get a little pair of scissors, very, very sharp, and very carefully cut off the excess resin. So here you can see the difference between what was made with the resin that was colored with alcohol ink versus the resin that was colored with the pastel chalk. Obviously the chalk is on the right-hand side. There's one more type of bee that I want to try and make. This is the powder that Miniverse gives to color resin in their kits. And this particular one has a beautiful gold yellow in the middle. And so we're going to use that to see what the bees would look like if they were finished with that kind of powder. This is a very, very tiny little vial. And so you just kind of scoop it in and add it to the resin. I found that this mixed easier than the pastel chalks did. And one thing that I really like is look at the sheen of this powder. It has kind of a glittery sheen to it that's really great. So I did the same thing where I just kind of put a very thin coat to start with and then went back and filled the rest of the mold up so that it would be a solid bee once they were finished. But it's kind of a two-step curing process. And again, with any excess resin, you can make a few more jelly beans. So here is what the 3 different types of bees that we've made so far look like. The pastel chalks on the left, Of course, the alcohol ink resin is in the middle, and the Miniverse mica powder is on the right. And I kind of like the mica powder bee because of that extra little glitter, that extra little sparkle. But I think we need to see what they're going to look like when we put them on the actual honey. Now this is Miniverse's resin. They call it honey. It's just a honey colored resin. And I want to put the bees on this, and I want to see what this is going to look like when we add it to our honey bear jar. Now you'll notice when you put the alcohol ink bee in, it virtually disappears. It's about the same color as the resin. But the chalk one really doesn't look too bad. They're pretty close, but once they're cured, you can see that the resin actually is more clear than the alcohol ink bee, but I still like the other two better. My number one choice is going to be the Miniverse mica powder bees. So these are the bees, and to dress the bees up, I have a Pigma Micron pen. This is a black ink pen. It's archival ink. This should adhere just fine to this resin, but I'll tell you, these little fine lines, although they are in the design and are easy to see, they are very hard to color in because they're so tiny. So let's get on to our bear. Now the lid, this is supposed to be used for drinking tea, and the hole in the top is for a straw to go through. Well, obviously we're not going to do that. So we're going to put a bee right smack in the middle of the top to kind of cover up that hole. Okay, so this is future Lisa. I noticed once I got this all done and I was editing this video that the ink on the bees really was not done well. So I went back, and using isopropyl alcohol, I was able to remove the ink and remark the bees. This looks so much nicer and cleaner. I mean, they're so tiny, and I just recommend that you take your time and be very, very precise when you're marking with that ink pen. And now back to our video. We're going to secure the little bee with a little clear resin and zap it with our UV flashlight. Now let's get to the bear. When I first thought of this, I thought I would tilt the bear sideways and kind of have a splash coming out of the top, but honestly I do a lot of splashes, so I wanted to do something a little different this time. In the end, I decided to just leave him sitting flat and just have honey dripping with bees. You'll notice this is the funnel that's pulled from the Miniverse Harry Potter Potions collection. Here's our honey from the charcuterie board, and we're going to pour it in. Look at how pretty of a color it is. I just think that is so beautiful. And it's pouring in pretty well until just about right now, and it starts to come off the rails. Okay, so you'll notice this is pretty thick resin and a very small hole. And so it just started to not go in well. And I pushed it in with the spoon, hoping that that would kind of get it going. Didn't help. I pulled the funnel out, and oh my gosh, here comes all the resin, and it's pouring down the side, and I was like, oh no! But I thought maybe this is a Bob Ross moment, and it's a happy accident. So I grabbed the UV flashlight and I started to cure the drip, and then I realized, well, wait a minute, I'm curing every bit of resin that has poured all over the outside of this bear. Too late. Oh my gosh, that honey jar is not anywhere near big enough to fill up this bear. So I'm gonna have to make some resin to finish filling up the honey bear. Luckily, I had gold colored alcohol ink, and I made a beautiful translucent colored resin. Now, why I didn't figure this out in the first place, I don't know, but I got out my pipettes. I use these a lot to fill up resin molds, and these pipettes worked perfectly to get the honey inside the bear. Let's add the cap on with our little bee sitting on top, and I did want this to be kind of askew because I want the honey jar to be open so that there's a reason that the honey is pouring out. I want to have a puddle of honey by the bear. The resin doesn't stick to the silicone mat, but it will adhere to the bear container itself. Once this cures, I add more resin to attach my bees. And remember, I clean up these lines quite nicely at the end of this video. They'll look a little better the next time you see them. And then on this big drip that I got when I pulled the funnel out, I have to put a honeybee on that so that there's a reason that there's a drip there. And then I looked around and I thought, you know, one right in the middle of his tummy would be kind of cute, so I put a bee there. The next piece I wanted to add is the honey dipper. Now the way you do this is tricky. What you have to do is let the resin drip as you're curing it. And that way you get this nice long bead that hardens as it's dripping. Now I needed to go back and add some more resin to it so that it would be strong enough to actually hold that honey dipper, freeze it into place. And this was the end result. Once I got the resin all hardened, this is how you get the honey dipper to stand up on its own. Then I put a bee at the very, very end with a little tiny drip of resin that looks like honey. And I decided I need some more dripping, but resin can be very, very unpredictable. So what I did on this is I went in and I sketched out exactly what I wanted the drip to look like on a piece of paper. And this way I had kind of a guide for where to actually put the resin to make just a little tiny thin piece of resin all on its own that can be added to this little sculpture later. And then the paper can just slide under your silicone mat. Hopefully your mat will be like mine is, where you can see through it. And then you have a way, kind of a pattern of how to make your resin. Now, as I said, resin has a mind of its own. And as you play with it, it tends to spread in places and in ways that you really don't intend it to. So I think what you're going to notice, especially after I cure this, is that it doesn't look anything at all like my little sketch. So, not good enough. You just peel that off, throw it away, clean up your little area, and start over. So here we go again, and I decided I was going to use my method the same as I did with my bees. I'm doing one little section of this drip, curing it, then I go and make another little section, and then I cure that, and then I go in and I make a third little section, and I cure that. And it was a lot easier to control that way and easier to get a little closer to what the actual idea was that I started with my sketch. Once it cured and it was nice and hard, see, that worked out really well. I just flipped it over, add a little tiny bit of resin to the back, stick it onto the honey dipper, and then cure it into place. And of course I have to add a bee onto that part of the drip as well. Now I looked and I thought, I wish I had one big drip in the middle here. And it was funny because as I was doing this, I looked over on my mat and I noticed that I had 3 little tiny drips of resin that were stuck to the mat. And I thought, well, those might work, although I wanted them to be just a little bit bigger. So I took some extra resin and I added to the 3 little drops that were already stuck to my silicone mat. Once these were cured, I decided the drip in the middle was probably the closest to what I wanted. And so I just put a little tiny drop of resin and stuck the drip where I needed it to be, and then zapped it with my UV flashlight to keep it in place. Okay, one more drip. I gotta do one more drip. I can't get enough drips. So I used this one too, and I put it on there, but then when I looked at it, I thought, well, all 3 of those drips look exactly the same size. They were just too symmetrical for me. So I popped off that last one that I added, and I turned it over and decided I'd kind of add it in the middle and only allow a portion of that drip to be seen from the front. When I sat back and looked at this bear after I finished with all the drips, I realized that his face really didn't show any character, and the details of his little face were not very prominent. I went online and I found a picture of real honey bear jars, and they had little black eyes and little bees for noses. Now, this bear is far, far, far too small to try and draw a bee onto. However, it does have a little kind of an X on his nose. So I grabbed the pen that I used to put the stripes on the bees, and I colored in his little eye and his nose. Now notice I didn't say eyes because I realized at the time that that long big drip, the Bob Ross happy accident, covered up the little bear's right eye, so I couldn't even color it in. All right, so I had to add one more bee, just one more bee, and then I promise we're finally done. Okay, so here is the finished bear in all his glory. This is the cleaned up version. The bees lines are much neater and much tidier than they were earlier. The drips, I think, work out just fine. I'm very happy with them. But resin never quite comes out exactly the way you want it to. But I think this is really cute, and I'm really happy with the results. I was so happy, as a matter of fact, I even added in our little test of the 3 tiny little bees in the front. So we've got an extra little puddle of bees. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up with a like. Be sure and subscribe because we've got a lot more fun stuff coming really soon. And thank you so much for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next video.